And joining me tonight is Michael Martinez, the Deputy Village Manager in Ruidoso, who has spearheaded a lot of these recovery efforts. Michael, first of all, thank you for joining us here on KTSM 9 News at 6. We heard from Secretary Noam last week on additional funding that the village will see for this latest disaster declaration. What has been promised to Ruidoso? What have you guys been able to collect so far, and what still needs to be collected in terms of federal assistance here?
Well, first and foremost, thank you guys for having me tonight. So the secretary had promised some advanced funding up front, and that was roughly $3 million. We had a conversation with her about 2 months ago. That funding has actually been passed on to the state, and the state of New Mexico has been working with us to try and make sure that we can access those funds as quickly as this week so that we can start any emergency repairs and other emergency work that we've been working on for the last couple of months for that reimbursement. And it's definitely been helpful. The funds that were talked about, that $11 million and 11 and change, about 2.4 million of those dollars actually come directly to the village of Ruidoso. The remaining funds go to Lincoln County and some of the other areas throughout New Mexico that were impacted. Those funds that came to us are actually from a project from last year's disaster. So it's not necessarily funds that are coming to us directly for this disaster that we had with the floods, but it's from the fires and floods from last year.
And I know recording of these impacts of the federal assistance is also important in terms of where that money goes and what it can be spent on in terms of recovery, especially considering, like you just mentioned, we're talking about two separate disaster declarations, one from last year's wildfires and subsequent flooding, and then this latest disaster declaration from last month's flood event. Why is it so important, and how do you kind of distinguish between the two? Because we're kind of seeing the effects of both disasters, really.
Yes, so it's actually very important that we make sure we track last year's disasters and what happened from last year. We do a lot of that. We do damage assessments. We make sure that we're documenting those through photos and engineering work and all of our other capacities and tools that we have to make sure that those are documented correctly. And then we have to make sure that we have that line drawn in the sand for this disaster to make sure that we're capturing what those new impacts are. And as we submit the previous projects from last year, those are reviewed by FEMA. And once they're reviewed by FEMA, they go to DHS for final approval. We recently have submitted, we've recently been notified that the submitted projects that we sent up, roughly 29 projects, those projects, 20 of those have been what are called obligated, which means that those funds are now getting pushed back down to the state level. People may confuse 29 projects with there was a lot more damage, but each project consists of multiple roads, hundreds of culverts, and other impacts. And so as those are obligated, those funds were just notified to the village that they were becoming available barely at late June. So as we access those, we still have to go through the federal procurement process for identifying engineers that would still need to do a 3 to 9 month design process, and then we can go back out to bid again for construction. So we may not really see the impact of those funds for about 2 years. And then we still have to draw the line in the sand, as I mentioned, for these impacts, measure what those impacts are. And this disaster date has already closed as of the 5th of this month. And so anything that happens after that, we really have to start calculating for a new disaster. But we are trying to make sure that we're putting those projects together. They'll be submitted, and that goes through a 3 to 9 month review at the federal level as well. And then we'll follow that same process that I just mentioned.
Certainly an ongoing process there. And Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, but this problem, it's not going away anytime soon. Those burn scars, that's the root of the issue, and none of that rainfall, of course, is being absorbed because of the scars. It just slides right off the ground, and in a matter of minutes, the river is flooded, and in some cases, and including, this just last month, it's dangerous historic levels there for the river. What is being done and what can be done to mitigate flooding in the area, or is the solution to just start kind of moving properties back away from the river?
Sure. So that's a great question, and you're exactly right. Last year after the fires, we knew that the burn scars would be impactful. We just didn't know how much. And so once the floods came 3 days after the fires, we started measuring that. We had to hire a hydrology and water engineering company, Cobb Finley, that came out and did what's known as an H&H study, or a hydrology and hydraulic study, really to measure the flows and the impacts of what that new water flow is going to look like. They also did a floodplain for us, a new floodplain to update FEMA's 2014 floodplain. And ultimately, what was determined is that we think these burn scars and the waters that are coming off of them will really be impacting us anywhere between 5 to 7 years, if not 10. And so that's going to be significant. After we were able to determine that, the village partnered with both the federal government and with the state government to try and do as much debris removal, as much mitigation work as possible. Thanks to the $12 million match from the governor's office and $38 million pledge from NRCS, which is a component of USDA, we were able to get $50 million for the area in Lincoln County and the village of Ruidoso. From those funds, we were able to move roughly 350,000 tons of silt out of the river. They were able to do roughly 15,000 linear feet of HESCO baskets. Those HESCO baskets are those giant kind of pink mesh baskets that people saw all around here. They're roughly 4,000 pounds a piece. Those were supposed to be mitigation purposes. And then trash racks that collect all this large debris throughout the river. Unfortunately, as you mentioned, these waters and the impacts from them, we have our regular monsoon season that starts basically June 15th to September 30th. And we see anywhere between 2 to 4 inches of rain every year during these monsoon seasons for each rain. And so that 2 to 4 inches is nothing really. Flooding would occur at like a 100-year flood at 4 inches an hour for roughly 2 to 3 hours regularly. Now, half an inch of rain gets us worried because we can see 5 to 7 to 10 feet of elevation in the river off of some of those flows, depending on where it falls on the burn scars. And so we're really starting to try and move on those previous mitigation programs that we had in place. Obviously, the federal government still needs to approve them. To desilt the river, it costs us $21 million each time we do it. And so we're limited in the number of times that we qualify for that. So we're definitely working on different programs. I think the main program that you talked about and how to move people out of the river is what's called a buyback program. There's several options out there. FEMA has 404 and 406 options, which is basically a percentage of all of the damage, and you get those funds back to help mitigate and help assist residents to move. There's other funds that we're actively seeking through NRCS. The village has requested roughly $605 million. That's through Lincoln County as the sponsor for buybacks to help make residents whole and to acquire that land to help mitigate those impacts to future residents in the future. But those funds require a 25% match. And so we're working with our local representatives to go after that 25% match at the state level, which could cost us anywhere between 180 to 270 million, depending on the amount that the federal government allows that budget to give. So it's a lot of information, but
all of it's super important, though, especially as you, again, try and pick up the pieces and try and navigate, as we said earlier, this new normal. Michael, thank you so much. The Village of Ruidoso Deputy Manager, thank you for joining us here. And certainly, we're really pulling for your community to be back up and running in no time.
No, thank you so much for having me, and we appreciate the support and all the coverage. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Michael, very much.